The smell of burning rubber and premium petrol filled the air. Akin's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Sola, look at me. Breathe," he roared. He didn't care that her father, the billionaire lion of Lagos, would have him jailed for even touching her hand. He grabbed her face, her skin cold against his callous palms, and pressed his lips to hers, not for love, but to force the very air from his own lungs into hers as the car tilted toward the third mainland bridge railings. Akin was a nobody, a driver from Mushin who spent his days navigating a bulletproof G-Wagon through the chaotic Lagos traffic for Sola, the heiress to the Olowo oil fortune. To her, he was just a part of the upholstery. To him, she was a goddess in a cage of gold. But when an accident turns out to be a calculated hit, the social barrier shatters. One desperate kiss saved her life, but it ignited a fire that would threaten to burn both their worlds down. The screech of tires against the asphalt of the third mainland bridge was a sound Akin would never forget, a high-pitched scream of metal that ended in a sickening crunch. The bulletproof G-Wagon, usually a fortress of Lagos luxury, was now a mangled cage of smoke and shattered glass, perched precariously against the rusted railings. Inside, the world was upside down. Akin kicked the deployed airbag away, his vision swimming with spots of red. He didn't check his own bleeding temple. His eyes were locked on the back seat where Sola lay pinned, her elegant royal blue lace gown stained with oil and grime. The engine hissed, a low, predatory growl that signaled an imminent explosion. Akin scrambled toward her, his hands trembling as he pried the jammed door open with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Sola's eyes were wide, glassy with terror, her chest heaving in shallow, useless jerks. The impact had crushed the dashboard into her space, and the acrid smoke was stealing her remaining oxygen. "Sola, look at me. Breathe." Akin choked out, but her lips were already turning a ghostly shade of blue. He didn't hesitate. He knew the taboos. He was the son of a mechanic, she was the daughter of a billionaire, but death was a faster judge than society. He tilted her head back, cleared her airway with a frantic sweep of his fingers, and pressed his lips to hers. He forced the air from his own lungs into hers, a desperate, rhythmic prayer for life. Once, twice, 3 times. Sola's body jolted, a ragged, gasping sob finally breaking through her throat as she caught the air. Just then, the pop-pop of suppressed gunfire echoed from the bridge behind them. In the side mirror, Akin saw 2 black SUVs skidding to a halt. Men in dark tactical gear stepped out, weapons raised. They weren't here to rescue, they were here to finish the job. "We have to move, now," Akin hissed, unbuckling her with a violent tug. He hauled her limp body out of the wreck just as a trail of leaking petrol ignited. He didn't run toward the road, he went over the side, gripping the maintenance ladder beneath the bridge's belly. With Sola slung over his shoulder like a precious sack of grain, he descended into the humid, dark shadows of the lagoon pilings. The world turned orange. A massive fireball erupted above them, the shockwave vibrating through the concrete pillars and rattling Akin's teeth. The G-Wagon was gone, a pyre of fire and twisted steel. Above, the assassins looked over the edge, staring at the burning water, while beneath them, hidden by the thick Lagos mist and the stench of the salt water, Akin held the heiress close, his heart thudding against hers in the silence of the underworld. The sun crawled through a jagged crack in a wooden window frame, stinging Sola's eyes until she forced them open. The air was thick, smelling of damp concrete, fried palm oil, and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her ribs pinned her back against a thin, lumpy mattress that felt more like a sack of sand than a bed. This wasn't her Italian silk sheets. Above her, a rusted ceiling fan hung motionless like a dead spider, and the walls, painted a faded, peeling turquoise, were covered in old newspaper clippings and a single, cracked mirror. Outside, the world was a cacophony of shouting neighbors, the rhythmic clack-clack of someone washing clothes in a bucket, and the distant roar of a yellow Danfo bus. "You're awake," a voice rumbled from the corner. Akin was sitting on a plastic bucket, his white driver's shirt now a rag of grease and soot. He was cleaning a deep gash on his arm with a piece of cloth soaked in local gin. Sola clutched the wrapper someone had thrown over her lace gown, her voice trembling. "Where is this? Where is my father's house?" "Akin, call the police immediately." She looked around the tiny room in horror, The "You face me, I face you" corridor outside was a symphony of poverty she had only ever seen from the tinted windows of her G-Wagon. To her, this wasn't just a room, it was a cage of squalor. Akin stood up, his shadow falling heavily across her. "If I call the police, we are both dead before the siren reaches the gate," he said, his voice hard. Sola began to protest, her heiress pride flaring up even in her broken state, but he silenced her with a look. "You think that crash was a mistake? You think Lagos roads just decided to swallow you today?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal, a severed brick line, its edges too clean to be a natural brick. "I checked the underside while you were out cold. These were cut, Sola. Precisely. Cleanly. Someone didn't want you to reach that board meeting." The blood drained from Sola's face, making her skin look like pallid marble against the grime of the room. The realization hit her harder than the crash had. The walls of her high society life hadn't protected her, they had been rigged to collapse. "Who?" she whispered, her hands shaking. Akin leaned in close, the scent of the bridge fire still clinging to him. "That is what we stay alive to find out. But for now, the billionaire heiress is dead to the world. Only the driver's sister lives in this room. If you want to see tomorrow, you better start acting the part." On the television screen, a flickering, ancient box perched on a wooden crate, the face of Chief Olowo filled the frame. The Lion of Lagos looked aged, his eyes bloodshot and his traditional agboda trembling with suppressed rage. He wasn't just a billionaire in that moment, he was a wounded predator. He announced a 50 million naira bounty for the capture and return of his daughter and the immediate neutralized arrest of the driver who had abducted her. To the world, the burning wreckage on the bridge was a crime scene, and Akin was the villain who had snatched the heiress from the flames to hold her for ransom. Sola watched the news in stunned silence, her hand over her mouth. "He thinks you took me," she whispered, the gravity of the bounty sinking in. In the streets of Mushin, 50 million naira was enough to make a brother sell his own blood. "He thinks what they want him to think," Akin replied, his voice low as he peered through the wooden slats of the window. Outside, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual neighborhood banter had turned into sharp, hungry whispers. Men in frayed singlets huddled over radio sets, and the local area boys were already patrolling the alleys with a new, predatory alertness. The police wouldn't come here. This was a place where the law was written in sweat and survival, but the greed of the streets was far more dangerous than any uniform. Akin grabbed a faded wrapper and a worn hijab he had borrowed from a neighbor under the guise of helping a sick relative. He tossed them to Sola. "Cover that your designer skin. From this second, you don't look up, you don't speak, and you don't cry. We are moving deeper into the trenches, where even the shadows have eyes." He led her out the back door, navigating a labyrinth of narrow corridors that smelled of charcoal smoke and open gutters. They moved through the no-go zones of the slums, places where the narrow alleys were choked with the steam of boiling pots and the watchful glares of men who lived outside the system. Sola stumbled over a discarded tire, the filth of the earth clinging to her ankles, but Akin's hand was a vice on her arm, pulling her forward. Every siren in the distance felt like a noose tightening. They were trapped between a father's misguided wrath and a city that would tear them apart for a piece of the Olowo fortune. Akin knew that in the trenches, the only thing more expensive than life was a billionaire's daughter, and he was the only thing standing between her and a watery grave in the lagoon. The morning in Mushin was a violent assault on Sola's senses. There was no air conditioning to filter the smell of parched earth and fermenting refuse, only the relentless heat that made her borrowed Ankara wrapper cling to her skin like a second, unwanted layer. From the small window of the safe house, she watched Akin. He wasn't the invisible man who held her car door open anymore. He was standing in the middle of a crowded alley, mediating a heated dispute between a market woman and a group of aggressive young men. He spoke with a quiet, grounded authority that didn't require a raised voice or a designer suit. He gave the woman a portion of his own meager earnings to settle the debt, and the tension in the air dissolved into respectful nods. Sola turned away, her heart heavy with a new kind of shame. In her world, problems were solved with lawyers and cold bank transfers. Here, survival was a communal effort of blood and sweat. She looked at her manicured hands, now chipped and stained with dust, and realized that her father's empire, the one she had been so proud of, was built on the backs of people like this. Worse, the refined board members she dined with were the ones who had paid to have her brakes cut, while the thugs she had been taught to fear were the ones currently keeping her breathing. Later that evening, as the orange sun dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the tenements, Akin returned with a steaming plastic bag. He sat on the floor, spreading out a newspaper to serve as a table. "Eat," he said simply, handing her a skewer of suya and a piece of roasted corn. "It's not cordon bleu, but it's honest." Sola took a bite, the spicy pepper searing her tongue, but it was the most flavorful thing she had ever tasted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't Sola Olowo, the oil heiress. She was just a woman sitting in the dark with a man who had risked everything for her. The silence between them shifted from awkward to intimate. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, the glow of a single candle flickering between them. "You could have run. You could have taken the bounty." Akin looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flame. "My father told me that a man who sells his soul for gold will find that gold very heavy when he tries to swim. I'd rather be poor and light, Sola." In that moment, the gap between the mansion and the slum felt smaller than it ever had. She reached out, her fingers grazing his calloused hand. It wasn't a billionaire's touch, it was a woman recognizing a hero. For a fleeting second, the danger outside didn't matter, only the shared heat of the food and the sudden, terrifying realization that she was falling for the man her father wanted dead. The piece of the motion safe house shattered with a frantic pounding on the back door. It was Emeka, Akin's oldest friend, his face sleek with a sweat that didn't come from the Lagos heat. He claimed he had seen patrol boys sniffing around the block, but Akin caught the way Emeka's eyes flickered toward the heavy gold chain suddenly resting against his chest, a piece of jewelry far too expensive for a man who hadn't held a job in months. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and foul, just as the distant wail of sirens began to converge on their position. "Move. Now." Akin roared, grabbing Sola's hand. They barely cleared the threshold before two black SUVs with tinted windows roared into the alley, scattering market stalls like autumn leaves. Akin dove into a battered, souped-up yellow Danfo bus he had kept hidden under a tarpaulin. Sola huddled on the floorboards as the engine screamed to life with a guttural cough. Behind them, the chief's elite security, men who cared more about the 50 million naira bounty than Sola's safety, opened fire. Akin didn't head for the highway, he steered the bus straight into the heart of Idemota Market. It was a suicide mission for any other driver. The market was a sprawling labyrinth of umbrellas, wheelbarrows, and human traffic so dense it looked impossible to penetrate. Akin drove like a man possessed, his hands a blur on the steering wheel. He clipped a mountain of plastic basins, sending them flying like oversized confetti, and drifted the heavy bus through a gap between two stalls that left less than an inch on either side. The SUVs behind them were forced to slow, their bulk working against them in the narrow veins of the city. Akin used the chaos to his advantage, weaving through the Hokoda riders and leaping over a pile of discarded timber. "Hold on," he yelled as he spotted a low-hanging pedestrian bridge. He didn't brake, he floored it, the roof of the bus scraping against the concrete with a shower of sparks that blinded their pursuers. By the time the security teams cleared the market clutter, the yellow bus had vanished into the smoke of the morning rush. Akin pulled into a darkened warehouse, his chest heaving, his knuckles white against the wheel. He looked at Sola, who was trembling but alive. He then looked at the rearview mirror, the image of Emeka's greedy face burned into his mind. In Lagos, trust was a luxury more expensive than oil, and Akin had just realized that the price of keeping Sola alive was going to cost him every friend he ever had. The warehouse was a tomb of rusted machinery and the smell of stagnant water, but for Sola, the silence was louder than the gunfire in Idemota. She sat on a wooden pallet, her fingers trembling as she sifted through the blackened, soot-covered remnants of her designer handbag, the only thing Akin had managed to snatch from the burning G-Wagon before it turned into a fireball. Amidst the melted lipstick tubes and charred credit cards, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It was a burner phone, cheap and plastic, miraculously shielded by the heavy leather of her bag. "Akin, look," she whispered, her voice cracking. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks, but as she pressed the power button, it flickered to life with a sickly blue glow. It wasn't her phone. It was a device she had never seen before, likely slipped into her bag during the frantic moments before they left the mansion for that fateful drive. There was only one conversation thread. Sola's breath hitched as she scrolled through the messages. The texts were clinical, cold, and filled with GPS coordinates of the third mainland bridge. "Ensure the brakes are drained. No survivors. The Olowo estate must clear by Monday." The sender wasn't a faceless corporate rival or a political enemy of her father. The contact name pinned at the top made the world tilt on its axis: Femi. Femi, her fiancé. The man who had knelt on one knee at the Whitbaker Hotel and promised to cherish her forever. As she scrolled further, she found frantic outgoing messages from the burner phone to an offshore account, screenshots of gambling debts totaling millions of dollars. The Prince of Lagos was a hollow shell, a man drowning in debt who saw her death as his only life raft. He didn't just want her gone, he needed her inheritance to pay off the sharks who were closing in on him. It was him, Sola breathed, the realization cutting deeper than any piece of shrapnel. The man I was supposed to marry, he's the one who cut the lines. Akin walked over, his face etched with a grim, knowing pity. He looked at the glowing screen and then back at the woman whose entire reality had just shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Sola looked up at him, her eyes no longer filled with the pampered innocence of a billionaire's daughter, but with a cold, flickering fire. The grief was there, but beneath it, a primal Lagosian steel was forming. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a witness. "He thinks he's won because the car burned," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady pitch. "He thinks the poor driver killed me. He's waiting for his payday, Akin. Let's make sure he gets exactly what he deserves instead." The damp walls of the warehouse seemed to close in as the reality of their situation took hold. They were ghosts in a city that was actively hunting them, and ghosts had no voice. Akin paced the concrete floor, his boots crunching on glass. "The bounty is active, and Femi is likely already moving to consolidate your father's assets," he said, his voice tight. "We can't hide in the mud forever, Sola. In Lagos, if you stay down too long, the earth just swallows you." Sola stood up, the cracked burner phone clenched in her hand like a weapon. "The Olowo anniversary gala is tomorrow night at the Eco Hotel. It's the only time my father, the board, and the entire press corps will be in one room. Femi will be there, playing the grieving fiancé, cementing his place as the heir. If we don't strike there, we don't strike at all." Akin laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You want to walk into the most secure building in Victoria Island, with my face on every news channel and you supposed to be a corpse in the lagoon." "They are looking for a driver and a victim," Sola countered, her eyes flashing with a cold brilliance. "They aren't looking for a prince and his queen." The gamble was insane. To pull it off, the hierarchy had to be flipped. Akin couldn't go as the help, he had to go as the power. Using the last of Sola's hidden emergency cash, kept in a hollowed-out heel of her spare shoes, Akin navigated the high-end boutiques of backstreet stylists who asked no questions for the right price. When he stepped out of the shadows the following evening, the transformation was jarring. The grease under his fingernails had been scrubbed raw, replaced by the weight of a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo and a Patek Philippe that cost more than a Mushin apartment block. His rugged features, once hidden by the grime of the road, now carried the sharp, dangerous edge of a tech mogul. Sola, draped in a borrowed emerald silk gown and a heavy veil that obscured her bruised face, looked at him not as her driver, but as an equal. "You look like a man who owns the city," she whispered, adjusting his cufflinks with trembling hands. "I feel like a man walking to his hanging," Akin replied, checking the hidden earpiece they'd rigged. The plan was simple but suicidal: crash the gates, bypass the biometric security using Sola's still active clearance, and reach the stage before the security detail could pull their triggers. As they climbed into a rented black Mercedes, leaving the trenches behind for the glittering lights of the island, Akin gripped the steering wheel. He wasn't driving for a wage anymore, he was driving for justice, and in the high-stakes game of Lagos royalty, the winner took everything while the loser disappeared forever. The grand ballroom of the Eco Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and heavy gold, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of the Lagos elite. At the center of the room stood Femi, draped in black velvet, playing the role of the grieving fiancé with a glass of champagne in one hand and a practiced look of sorrow on his face. He was in the middle of a toast, his voice echoing through the speakers about the tragic loss of his beloved Sola, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The room fell silent as Akin stepped into the light. He didn't look like the man on the wanted posters. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who belonged in the room, his midnight blue tuxedo cutting a sharp silhouette against the gold-leafed walls. Beside him, a veiled woman in emerald silk walked with a spine of steel. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, confused by the presence of this unknown mogul and his mysterious companion. "The tribute is moving, Femi," a voice rang out, clear and cutting. Sola reached up and pulled back the veil, revealing the faint bruises on her face and eyes that burned like cold fire. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Plates crashed to the floor. The Lion of Lagos, Chief Olowo, froze, his glass shattering in his hand as he stared at his daughter, back from the dead. "Sola." Femi stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It was the driver. He kidnapped you." He pointed a trembling finger at Akin, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Security. Arrest him. He's the one who tried to kill her." "The only person who tried to kill me is the man who cut my brakes to pay off his gambling debts," Sola declared, her voice amplified by the stunned silence of the room. She held up the cracked burner phone, the screen glowing with the evidence of Femi's betrayal. "I have the messages, Femi. I have the coordinates of the bridge. I have the proof of your blood money." The elite began to murmur, the tide of opinion turning with the speed of a Lagos storm. Seeing his world crumbling, Femi's mask of refinement shattered. He didn't reach for an explanation, he reached into the waistband of his trousers. The gleam of a snub-nosed revolver caught the chandelier light. "If I'm going down, I'm not going alone," he screamed, leveling the gun at Sola. Before he could pull the trigger, Akin moved. It wasn't the move of a billionaire, but the reflex of a man who had survived the trenches. He lunged across the space, his shoulder slamming into Femi's chest just as the first shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly into the high ceiling. The ballroom erupted into chaos, but Akin held his ground, pinning the Prince of Lagos to the marble floor while the press cameras flashed, capturing the true face of the villain and the hero who had risen from the mud to save the goddess. The chaos of the ballroom began to settle into a stunned, ringing silence as security hauled Femi away, his screams of protest fading into the plush corridors of the Eco Hotel. Chief Olowo stepped forward, his face an unreadable mask of weathered power. He didn't look at the press or the gathered billionaires, he looked directly at Akin, who was still adjusting his tuxedo jacket, his breathing heavy. Then, the Lion of Lagos did something no one expected, he laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound, but a dry, rasping bark of satisfaction. "You did well, Akin," the chief said, his voice carrying a terrifying weight. He turned to Sola, who was still trembling from the adrenaline. "And you, my daughter, you finally learned that blood is only thick when it is tested by fire. You survived the trenches, and you survived the snake I let into our garden." Sola froze, her eyes narrowing. "You let him. You knew Femi was a gambler. You knew he was dangerous." The chief leaned on his cane, his eyes cold. "I knew he was weak. I knew he would try something. But I needed to know if you were truly an Olowo, or just a girl living in a glass house. I didn't cut the brakes, but I didn't stop him either. And I chose Akin to drive you that day because I knew he was the only man in this city whose soul wasn't for sale. It was a test, Sola. For both of you." The betrayal in the room shifted. It wasn't just Femi anymore, it was the cold, calculated cruelty of a father's legacy. The chief turned to Akin, offering a hand heavy with gold rings. "For your loyalty, I am offering you the head of my security division. A salary that will make you a king in motion. A seat at the table where the real decisions are made." Akin looked at the hand, then at the glittering, hollow opulence of the ballroom. He thought of the "Face Me I Face You" apartment, the shared plate of suya, and the raw honesty of the trenches. He looked at Sola, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Keep your seat, Chief," Akin said, his voice steady and devoid of malice. "I've spent enough time driving other people's lives. I don't want your money, and I don't want your table. I'm starting my own firm, one that protects people from the monsters in the dark, including the ones in silk suits." He turned to walk away, but Sola stepped forward, her hand slipping into his. The billionaire heiress didn't look back at her father. "He's going to need a partner," she said, her voice ringing with a new, independent authority. A silent one. And maybe, in time, something more. As they walked out of the galley together, leaving the Lion of Lagos standing alone in his golden cage, the morning sun began to rise over the lagoon. They were no longer driver and passenger. They were two survivors, ready to build a kingdom of their own on the bedrock of the truth they had found in the shadows. Thanks for watching. More heart-touching stories coming in this week. Stay tuned to this channel and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to grow our little family.